much for the introduction. Again, my name is Dr. Hannah Conway, and I'm in the history department here at Duke. Um, I'm very excited to be involved in this conference because these are not really conversations we have a lot in the field of sort of academic history, and I'll dig into that a little bit. Um, yeah, so. Uh, as I was introduced, my current research project, because I am in a book discipline, a book writing discipline, we have to write books as career markers for tenure, promotion, etc., um, is a revision of my PhD dissertation, currently titled "How Infrastructures Age: Engineering, Nature, and Environmental Justice in the Lower Mississippi Delta." And the heart, let's see here, there we go. And at the heart of this book are um, three case studies, and each one of these centers on a community identified site of concern. So, while lots of historical research is independent, takes place in an archive, the way that I incorporated communities from the start as I was conceiving of this project was looking at places that had, for decades, in many instances, been identified by communities as infrastructures that were of particular concern and how they impacted communities. So, um, the first chapter takes the whole sort of Mississippi River together and looks at what the Army Corps has done along it and how it has contributed to some of these issues. But the three specific sites are a now closed fossil fuel coal-fired plant in Memphis, Tennessee, Army Corps project called the Yazoo Backwater Project that's been ongoing since the 1940s. It is still incomplete, and the so-called spaghetti bowl of petroleum canals and pipelines that have been cut in and around the Terrebonne Basin of Louisiana. Um, I'm happy to chat more about how the aging and impact sort of and creates environmental and community health concerns in each of these places, but I'm going to skip through this graph just for time's sake. So the central research questions for this project are fairly simple. How do large technological infrastructures impact community environmental health as they age? So not just when they're constructed or not just when they fail in kind of a crisis moment of failure when we often pay attention to infrastructure, but how do they uh, cause environmental and community harm in their day-to-day operations, something that I call normal aging, processes of normal aging. Then I look at how do infrastructures reorder or order people in places. Infrastructures obviously form the built world around us. They have impacts on accessibility of spaces, in addition to things like burdens of pollution and how those are placed upon certain communities. Infrastructures also have risk inherent in them in their construction and in their normal aging. And in many ways, they serve to displace that risk onto environments and communities that are not as valued or do not have as much political sway within the landscape. So, and then finally, I also think about how infrastructures can be more just. In some ways, some of my arguments are that infrastructures actually curtail environmental justice when we look at the principles because of how they create really insidious path dependencies that we can't escape from. They limit the kinds of options we have for remediation. But I do think about ways that they might be more just, more democratic, and we might involve communities more in our infrastructure decisions. Um, I also draw from, so the primary method that I've used to then answer these research questions, again, is archival research. But I've also taken a sort of broader range of methods in thinking about these, how to answer these questions that do put historical inquiry in conversation with community members and with stakeholders. So the primary way that I did that was fieldwork with community organizations and interlocutors. I did actually live in Memphis for the 4 years I was completing my dissertation, even though technically my home institution was in Boston. That was both because I was very cold in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I really wanted to live back in the South. I'm from the South. I'm born and raised in Virginia. But also, it felt really important to me to do my work in community that I was accountable to and to live in the community that I was studying. I hadn't planned to live there for 4 years, but I was a COVID dissertation writer. I moved in the fall of 2019, and then most of the community stuff that I was going to engage with shut down. So, also, some of the dissertation is about how communities deal with certain kinds of unexpected crises, like a pandemic, because fossil fuel infrastructures, polluting infrastructures are still being built and still having issues through the pandemic. I also took oral histories with community members and folks who are involved in certain kinds of remediation, watchdog groups, folks who are local Sierra Club chapters. Did a lot of documentary photography. My undergraduate degree is in photography, so thinking about how these sites come together, driving out to uh, flood control infrastructures in the backwaters of Mississippi to see what they actually look like in place. And then when I was analyzing and thinking about reading through my archival evidence, I also really tried to think about how we can actually employ those principles of environmental justice, the sort of 17 founding principles of environmental justice that are articulated at the first Global People of Conference of Color Conference, as starting points for critical analysis, in particular thinking about mutual respect, informed consent, and self-determination as these, sort of central foundational stated goals of environmental justice, and how those have been curtailed or how those are made difficult to achieve through the processes that we build, maintain, and repair infrastructure. I've also had commitments throughout to research that is reciprocal and accountable to questions and issues of data sovereignty, ethical engagement, and also generative refusal. There's a lot of histories of extractive research from academic researchers, and a lot of communities are very hesitant to work with researchers. And I think it's important to listen to those reasons that community members might be hesitant to work with academics, particularly when you're coming in with an attachment to an elite institution, or you're not someone who's from the area. Even though I'm from the South, I'm not from the Mississippi Delta. So that was something I thought about a lot during this project. Beyond the dissertation, I've done some other community-facing work, I think, that also thinks about how we define communities. So I've been on a research project for about a decade now, looking at the history of the 1970 Clean Air Act. Why was carbon dioxide not regulated under the Clean Air Act? How much did legislators in 1970 really know and understand about climate science? Our research shows that they knew and understood a lot about global climate change and its possible impacts. And that's research that it was brought to my advisor at the time by legal scholars, environmental scholars at the Harvard Law School. And it was really meant to be research that can benefit a community of experts, that can help a community of experts think about how to write better policy, because historians are better positioned to answer some of these questions, particularly related to the major questions doctrine that the Supreme Court has relied on more recently, than necessarily legal scholars are or scientists are. I also have worked with uh, tribal communities, native organizing groups, most recently in response to the 2023 draft environmental impact statement released by the Army Corps related to the Lake Oahe crossing of the Dakota Access Pipeline. We helped prepare not only an expert comment to the Corps, but also a one-pager fact sheet on the history of the pipeline, the threats posed by BTEX chemicals if it spills, that was then handed out to community members for talking points during meetings with the Army Corps. And I've also been on a Bass Connections team this year, which has been really exciting. I've gotten to know a lot about Eastern North Carolina. And we're looking at community identified concerns over ghost forestation in the coastal plain. Uh, so how do I come up with my research questions? I'd like to start this discussion by setting up the idea that both community-centered environmental justice work and community-centered historical work require by their nature interdisciplinarity in the kinds of questions that we ask and the methods that we use to answer them, right? So what does that mean? What do I mean by that? The first is that there are lots of tools in the toolkit of environmental justice, and my work really argues that historical inquiry needs to be an important one of those tools for a number of reasons. The first is just that present day material conditions are the result of historical processes. These things don't come out of nowhere, obviously. So processes of racial capitalism, settler colonialism, genocide, dispossession, dehumanization of people and communities. And many of these processes began long before the 20th century. So, for Indigenous people, environmental racism begins with first contact. For African American descendants of enslaved people, it begins with forced removal from ancestral lands during chattel slavery. These stories of dispossession and removal are always environmental stories, even if they aren't positioned as such. The extraction and exploitation of land and people begets the extraction and exploitation of all of our resources. And the impacts of environmental degradation accumulate over time. That's what happens and how we get to what we call cumulative impacts, right? So, scholar Rob Nixon has called this slow violence, something that he defines as violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space. And my work seeks to understand how community members who are concerned about infrastructures make this slow violence visible. And there's also a high burden of proof in environmental justice claims, particularly claims of environmental racism. And slow violence can happen in ways that are very overt, but also in ways that are covert or incidental. And I think careful historical analysis can help us put some specificity on the root causes as well as perpetrators that should be held accountable and victims that should be centered. Uh, but academic historians, like I said, aren't particularly well trained to do to do this kind of work. This is an excellent text by Kate Brown. She looks at some of the ways that historians are not particularly well situated to do research in place. Places are often left out of nonfiction prose. Many writers presume that the site of action is given. Historians also are not often accountable to the communities that we write about because we're writing about communities that are maybe no longer living. So historians read, intimate letters and diaries, which the authors never meant to be public. And somehow the fact that that reading is posthumous softens the violation. We often assume if something is in an archive that that is sort of fair game for research. And we're not often reflexive of our positionalities. It's something that folks talk a lot about in these environmental justice spaces that historians just do not. Historians, quoting Kate Brown again, have few such disciplinary practices to account for their presence in the acts of gathering materials, choosing sources, rejecting others, and soliciting information. We are deeply embedded in creating and redefining notions of nation, community, personal identity, and biography, yet we lack the disciplinary rigor to reflect on those intimate and sensitive processes. And I think that's really important for something that I've been trying to think about in my own work. And so when I came to my project, how did I do that? If historians are particularly well trained to do this, I drew on a lot of interdisciplinary literature. I'm just going to run through these sort of super quickly. I am a historian of science. I did my PhD in a history of science department, so we're closely allied with science and technology studies, STS. And there's a really rich tradition of doing work that is more anthropological, more fieldwork based. Folks like Barbara Allen, Christine Wally at MIT, Sarah Wiley, who look at how communities generate and share knowledge around pollution. I've also drawn a lot from the human geographies and cultural anthropology. Most recently, a lot of my brilliant colleagues at Mississippi State University, who also work on the Yazoo Delta, have gotten a significant NSF grant that I obviously hope is not going to suffer from funding cut because this is really important. And they do much more in situ research than I do, but my historical research is something that's been helpful for them in sort of thinking about their project and what it looks like. I also draw a lot on anthropological, ethnographic methods from folks who are doing work sort of within their own communities or in communities they've left and come back to. Lots of public history does this better than we do as academic historians, but this is happening in academic spaces. So I recently had a chance to review a really excellent article about descendant-centered research that was happening at Williams College. Just a plug for the Duke History Plus department. History Plus is a summer program for students, and we always work with community partners to produce a specific research deliverable. So we're trying to figure out ways to train historians to do this better. I've also been obviously very informed by Indigenous STS. The CLEAR Lab up at Nova Scotia has a lot of really excellent methodological thoughts in it, as well as other Indigenous scholars from different disciplines who are thinking about how their communities have been impacted by extractive research and how we can do that better. So, in sum, I'm sorry, I know I'm a little over time. What does make a good community-guided historical research question, right? Specifically historical. These are just opinions. So the first four are things that I would say to any history graduate student, undergraduate student trying to think about how to ask a question. So I think specificity is important, maybe even particularly more so for community guided stuff. There is a lot of history. And to ask an answerable question, which I think is key, you have to ask a question that you're capable of answering, that meaningfully addresses a human community concern. You really have to narrow your focus in a way that you otherwise might not, right? Like I'm not writing an entire history of Memphis. I'm writing really specifically about this piece of infrastructure in Memphis as it's connected to some other sort of processes. Scope, how broad of a geography? What temporal period? Which sources, voices, ontologies, and epistemologies do you want to center? That's obviously really part of doing justice work. It's not just writing from communities with a lot of power and position. Expertise, you have to be familiar, you have to have training to navigate archives, do oral history. You also have to overcome scholarly tendencies towards introversion. It's really easy as a historian to just spend time in the archive and not go talk to people, and it you have to overcome that a little. And then adaptable. My research questions that I finished with are not the ones I started with. And I think maybe that's something that sets historical inquiry apart from other social sciences or science, the sort of more physical sciences. As new information is gathered, we need to be responsive to it. And so those things change over time. Uh, Time is another one. As you all said, it takes lots of sustained engagement to do good community work. You have to build meaningful connections. You have to build trust. You have to suss out the concern and also determine what questions haven't been answered, particularly historically. Reciprocity is something to think about. How will your work benefit the community, not just yourself? Accountability, how will you make sure that it's not extractful or harmful? What kinds of checks and balances are you going to have there? And then I think also care. So care for your work, care for the people and places that you do it for, and also for yourself. I think this is an important conversation to have in an environmental justice space. I spend a lot of time examining historical records that are really deeply traumatic. They're steeped in overt racism. They detail devastating and ecological and human health costs. They're also often outright gleeful about the eradication of Southeastern Native ancestors. And I think for us to show up as researchers, for ourselves, for the communities that we're working with, we do have to be careful about that and take care of ourselves and respect some boundaries and be attentive to our own sort of support systems around the work that we do and how much, like, what research questions we ask and can we like emotionally support ourselves through answering those questions. That's it. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I'm trying to navigate the Zoom world. Guess I'm a little rusty. Can you all see my screen? Great. Fantastic talk, Hannah. Thank you. That'll be a little bit tough to follow. Um, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about some work that I've been doing for the last several years in Louisiana. It's called a community engaged study of toxic particulate matter near an open burn, open detonation hazardous waste thermal treatment facility. And I'm just going to kind of touch on some different aspects of the project. I do have like actual measurement results in here, but I'm probably not going to go into them that much other than to illustrate how we're using them. So anyway, I want to also thank the collaborators on this project, including Chi Guo, who is the postdoctoral researcher who's been working with me for the last 4.5 years or so. Martine Machu Campbell, who just finished her PhD and is now over at Emory. Matilda O'Dara, who's at Georgia State, and me. And we've had a number of other collaborators working on this over the years. So just to tell you a little bit about this community, um, at the time we were doing this study, there were about 1,600 residents in the town of Colfax. Colfax is, you could see in the little inset map, which I know it's not the best map, but you can sort of trace the shape of the state of Louisiana. And Colfax is kind of in the ankle, about 2 hours or so southeast of Shreveport, about 2.5 hours, maybe 2 and 3/4 hours northwest of Baton Rouge. And it's a very rural part of the state. Um, the town itself is about 2/3 African American and 1/3 white, with a very low median income. 38% of the people live below poverty. Most people do not have a college education, and it's a population that's been shrinking over the years. What we've heard from a number of community members is that young people, when they have opportunities to either go to college or join the military or find jobs, tend to leave. Um, the surroundings are hot and humid, rolling hills. It's very pretty there. Um, but you can see when you go through that there's a lot of poverty. And in the 1980s, one of the residents there, a guy named Richard Crane, owned a tract of land. I guess he probably owned around 700 or so acres. And he started this facility there where they were storing and disposing of explosives, but in small enough amounts that most of the residents really weren't aware of what was going on. And so he began the process of getting a permit from the state of Louisiana in 1983. It was awarded in 1985. The facility changed hands a number of times, but again, people weren't really sure what was going on there. So it kind of just started off as a small local operation. Someone owned land and wanted to make some money off of it. Um, Sold to a bigger company, changed to Safety Clean, and then in 2002, a company named Clean Harbors purchased this facility. They still own the facility, and it's Clean Harbors is out of Massachusetts and operate across the nation. They started to expand, and then there was this incident in 2012 where in Minden, and actually, if I go back to the map here, Minden is close to Shreveport in the northwest corner of the state over here. Uh, they had it was a Louisiana National Guard site, and they had been storing literally 15 million pounds of explosive waste there. Some of that waste went back to the Vietnam War. And I think what happened is that maybe some water seeped in, the integrity of the storage bunker broke down over time, and then there was a massive explosion. After that explosion, the residents in Minden organized and pushed to get that stuff out of their community. They built a closed burn facility to deal with some of that material. Their site was deemed a Superfund site. Sorry, I'm getting cold, so I'm just sticking my sweater back on. Um, and so they organized, and the waste some of the waste anyway, that was produced from this site was then sent down to Colfax. And over the course of the next few years, they started processing this material by blowing it up, burning it out in the open. They were often using perchlorates to as a fuel accelerant. Now or I shouldn't say now, but in the later years, they were using diesel. And so around this time, like 2016 or so, the community started organizing. They noticed after the waste started burning, a lot of different things, which I'll tell you about in a minute. It's probably better hearing a bit about how the residents were framing their experiences. But it started having enormous impacts. And then the community organized. They did get a small settlement in 2022, but $605,000 to settle with the state over violations in enforcing the permit is not a lot, considering that people were getting really sick. Let me go to the next slide. This is an image on the right of this facility. This was taken by the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality, so this image is in the public domain. Um, they this was the last commercially operating open burn, open detonation hazardous waste facility in the country. It actually was something that EPA had outlawed in the late 1980s, but this facility received a kind of was grandfathered in. And you can see there are these 20 tables. They're just concrete tables. A lot of them are kind of broken down. Um, there are 10 storage magazines. They have a storage capacity of 50,000 pounds of waste. And so the community was organizing. And they wanted to document what was going on. So they reached out to LSU, being the largest research university in the state, and then LSU was looking for an exposure assessment person to help them. At the time when this conversation was going on between Colfax residents and LSU, I was actually working at the EPA, and they reached out to a friend of mine looking for help, and my friend referred them to me, and we started talking, and that was how I ended up getting involved. So, then what happened is we actually would meet with the leader of the community coalition over the course of a year or so. We also involved in those meetings were talking with another woman named Wilma Subra, she was given a MacArthur Genius Award in 1998 for her work engaging communities and helping them to organize and use environmental data to advocate for themselves. And so she was the one who was going from New Iberia, which is south of Baton Rouge, driving frequently out to Colfax and talking with the community about ways that they can organize and use scientific data. And so the community had really gotten behind the idea of engaging with a university to get data that could help them. And the understanding all along was that our role was to gather data in support of their efforts. So then I started working with LSU and designing this study, listening to the community, talking with them about what they wanted, and trying to put elements of that in the proposal. We were funded, and this was part of a larger Superfund research program that included toxicological research and engineering research, and we were funded to do this community engaged study. Our funding began on March 1st of 2020. So right before the pandemic hit, we were positioned to start. So then once we started getting lockdown orders, our plans to go to Colfax and start holding in-person meetings were kind of turned on their side. And so we started holding oral history interviews actually over Zoom. And I want to say that one thing just to acknowledge, Hannah talked about how you really need expertise to conduct this kind of work. And that was something I didn't have. And my student who was working with me on the oral histories, Matilda, didn't have that experience either. So we started engaging with a couple of social scientists on our campus. We were talking extensively with Blair Kelly, who was in the history department at NC State at the time, and since moved over to lead the Center for the American South, I believe, at UNC. Trying to remember when she moved over there. It might have been around 2021 or 2022, but she was really instrumental in helping us gain some initial footing in the social sciences world. And so we had these kind of open-ended interviews, and she talked us through a lot of that process. We were also working pretty extensively with a colleague, Louis Rivers, who was in our department, but is a social scientist, and then moved to EPA. Louis moved over to EPA in about 2022. And so we were conducting these interviews, which I'll talk about in a second, and then planning those in conjunction with a sampling campaign because what the community told us from the get-go was that what they wanted from us was data. They wanted data to substantiate their experiences. And so I won't talk a lot about our sampling design. You can kind of see where we landed with how we placed our samplers, which essentially coincides with where a lot of the residents were seeing smoke and where people lived. But I want to spend a little time on our first aim, which was engaging the community. And our hypothesis was that participation by this environmental justice or injustice community, really, in Colfax, in designing the study for exposure vepfors, how that would foster sustained empowerment among community members to reduce exposures to air pollutants. Initially, we were planning to go and hold focus group meetings, but we changed that when the pandemic kept us in our homes, and our interviews were conducted over Zoom out of necessity. So we used oral histories to document the community exposures with pollutants. And at this time, we were learning about oral history as a tool, looking to communities in Mossville, Warren County, North Carolina, so Mossville, Louisiana, Warren County, North Carolina, um, oral histories that had been conducted around the Louisiana Gulf Coast. And our goal was really to elevate community voices and using those narratives to synthesize the experience across the community to give a coherent picture of environmental health hazards. We took these open-ended interviews and we when we designed the questions, we were working pretty extensively with Dr. Kelly, and then basically held conversations and had I want to say a script, a guide of questions would be a better way to put it, just to make sure that we were learning about things that related to health and the environment. But we left these conversations pretty open-ended to also hear about things like residents' experiences in the community and what the community was like when they were growing up, what their adulthoods were like. A lot of the people we were talking with were older adults, and partly because those were the people who were in the coalition. And a lot of the younger people, as I mentioned before, were leaving the community more for economic opportunity. But we made sure to incorporate questions about health and the environment. And so after these interviews, we mapped people's experiences. So we would ask a little bit about their health. And then some people were telling us about sudden weight gain or loss, which are symptoms of thyroid disease. Some people were telling us about diagnoses. A lot of people were telling us about skin damage. I showed this picture of a woman named Brenda Clay that we've been working with over the last few years, and these are her children. And she had told us about things like losing her hair, and she's been really vocal about that to illustrate to people outside of the community what she's experienced, what it meant to her to lose her hair, to experience scarring on your skin, and what that feels like. People talk to us about respiratory disease. We also mined public records of community meetings when people have testified before the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality for permit hearings. And we combined that information that was gleaned from those uh, written documents of testimony with the oral histories to make a lot more locations on our maps. And what we did is we actually mapped these to show where residents stated that they were experiencing these diseases or symptoms. And these were those little red dots. And then we also mapped in blue where residents did not state that they had those diseases. And sometimes it was because the conversation just went in a different direction. So it didn't necessarily mean they didn't experience those things, but just that they didn't mention those things. So we mapped that information and it gave us some pretty good idea that if you compare the site of the facility, which is noted at these crosshairs, which is a little hard to see, but it's at the center of the image, um, with if you look at that location and then you look at where some of those residents were, we found that the greatest number of statements attesting to having experienced symptoms was in the Rock community, which is a very impoverished community just south of the facility. Um, we took measurements afterwards, and I'm not going to go through the measurements. That's a little more on the air quality side of things, except to say a couple of quick things rather than talking through our data. To say that we got to the design of this study, where we placed our monitors, how we went about conducting those measurements, the kinds of species we were looking for after talking with the residents and making a determination with them on where we needed to sample and what we needed to sample for. And as we collected data over time, we would not only collect it for the peer-reviewed literature, which we did, we are working on publishing some of this information, but importantly, we would basically collect all of this information. And every time we go to the community, every time we go in to service our monitors, um, we hold community meetings, and usually somewhere between 20 and 30 people will show up, and we'll talk through our latest results with them. So we always put together these booklets, and you can see just an example of the cover and the kind of information that we would include inside of the booklet to talk with residents about what we're finding and what that means. And residents have used these booklets to go and talk with their doctors, to go to hearings and talk about what their experiences were and what the data means. And we always try to put the data into plain language so that it's useful to the community members, because they don't have a scientific training, but largely people understand what they're going through. And we've, been able to actually share some pretty complicated data with them and just talk through it together and have conversations. And when we go to the community to service our monitors and have these meetings, we take a lot of time when we go from house to house to talk with them individually about what we're finding to in addition to these meetings. And I think that's been really helpful because it's not when we go there, we're not like we're the scientists who know everything and listen to us, but we have a conversation and we always take the perspective that we're guests in the community and we're there to listen and just amplify the experiences that people have had there. We've found that, our measurements have borne out the experiences that people have shared. We've found a lot of metals in the community. We've found a lot of free radicals in our measurements, which indicate the combustion processes that were going on. We're now actually in a second phase of measurements. Uh, well, the facility, and actually the good news of the story is that after the community advocated so long, a new permit was issued in June of 2023 that ordered the facility to cease open burning in December of 2023. And so the facility is now challenging that because they think their rights have been infringed upon. But they haven't really been burning since December of 2023. And the people in the community in the coalition asked us to keep measuring after the fact, kind of to keep an eye on it and see if, in fact, they are holding to the permit. Um, they are allowed to open a closed burn facility, and so we're also waiting to see what the impacts of construction of that are going to look like, and that construction hasn't begun yet. But we have published a few papers on our oral history work from this, and we're working on publishing the measurements as well. I do think, as someone who formerly worked at the EPA, that that's important because that's something that eventually, when there is policy to be made around these kinds of facilities, whether at the state level or at the federal level, um, that those data can help. So in my view, it is important to get that information out to amplify this message so people hear what's been going on. The papers that we've published so far have been mostly about the oral history work, in fact. And right now, after taking time to analyze those data carefully, um, we finally have papers going in about the measurements. So we've got some in review now about that and more to come. But the papers actually we've published so far have been on the oral history work. But it's helped to amplify that message. And that's kind of our goal, and we've made friends there over time. You know, the people that we go there when we see them, we have really good conversations and we're there to serve them and they know that and they've seen us out working in 100-degree weather, rushing to get the samples changed and taking care with our data, and taking care with our physical samples that we collect. So that has also helped to earn the trust of the community members, but they know that we're there to serve them, and I think that goes a long way. So I'm going to take the spotlight off of myself now. I probably also took a little too long, so I'll turn it over to Anais.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Jennifer and Hannah as well. I have so many questions, so hopefully we'll get more time to chat afterwards. So hi everyone, my name is Anais Roque, and today I'm gonna try to share my slides. Can you see my slides? Awesome. So today I'm gonna be talking to you a little bit about a case study, a community that's very dear to my heart, and I have been collaborating for the past 4 years, very in this co-creation space, but have been engaging with them since 2019. And so the title of my presentation today is Participatory Budgeting, a Community-Led Intervention for Resource Security Following a Disaster. So to give you some context, I'm from Puerto Rico, which is a unincorporated territory of the United States. That's also, recognized as a colony of the United States in the Caribbean. As you will see in this map, it's a map of Puerto Rico. Particularly, this work focuses on the community of Corcovada. Corcovada is a rural community on the western side of Puerto Rico that has approximately 625 residents. Residents in Corcovada have been organized primarily around issues of water justice, and those are broadly defined in terms of water access, quality, reliability, for over 40 years, when they were forced to develop and maintain their own community-based aqueduct to provide water for their residents. I started working in Corcovada when I was doing my master's project because we had a big hurricane event back in 2017, Hurricane Maria, and Corcovada was just one of these communities that was really able to respond and in many ways recover fairly quickly compared to other communities in the continental, in the main island and also in the other islands. But Corcovada has a lot of different challenges. They are prone because of their geography to landslides, earthquakes, and floods. And this constantly results in power outages, limited access to resources, and water shortages. Because it's a rural community, it is disproportionately impacted by hazards, and that also amplifies their public health challenges, which includes things like diabetes, asthma, water quality, and mental health. It's important to say that Corcovada has one of the highest percentages of adults with that are 65 years and older, and the lowest medium household income of only 11,078 dollars, which the average household income in Puerto Rico is 20,000. So that is, double the lowest of continental United States. So when I was working in Corcovada during my master's studies, I wanted to just generally understand how leaders were using their social relationships to better respond to the disaster that Hurricane Maria created in their community. And later on, I built that into my dissertation, and I continue to, be interested in issues not only about social capital, but also about how resources were managed, and particularly food, water, and energy. And so in 2021, Natural Hazard Center opened an opportunity for calls for proposals that would address what they called community health resiliency and disasters in U.S. territories. So I saw the call and called one of my local partners and just asked them, hey, will you be interested in applying to this? I think there's a lot of good conversations that we can have around specifically these issues of food, water, and energy, and particularly because leaders, at least in Puerto Rico, and I imagine this is applicable in continental US, they tend to be the first responders to disasters, right? And so I kind of wanted to be able to understand really how they were able to manage these relationships. And now within the context of COVID, and also considering that between 2017 when Hurricane Maria and Irma hit and 2021, the community had already experienced other types of hazards, right? So it was also a matter of understanding how different types of hazards impact their quality of life and how they respond to this. So with that, our community partner, Annie Quintana, was like, yeah, let's apply, let's do it. And we were successful in getting that award. And she became a co-investigator in the grant, right? So we wrote it together. We, gave us feedback on what to include, what not to include. And that ended up being in this first award that really tried to answer this broad question of, what is the relationship between social capital, community health resilience, and compounding hazards in this community. And to do that, we did a 2-day workshops with 16 community leaders. This was the first time that leaders were together in the same space after the pandemic has started. So it was an opportunity to also get them together, interact, and really collectively think about how much they have been able to advance challenges in their communities throughout the years. Within that, we did a community mapping exercise focusing on these resource insecurities, and then we draw on content to co-create what we later called, and I'll show you in a minute, a food, water, energy security, health, and disaster management assessment. So like a survey to better understand these dynamics. Central to the approach that we took in this first award was that we wanted to create products that were not only to advance my academic agenda as a junior faculty, but really, what can we leave in the community that will be beneficial? And so the community mapping exercise was one of these, right? Because we wanted for them to not only understand these things that they already understand them, right? Like they already knew the challenges and the opportunities, but it was an opportunity to have them in one space. And the mapping exercise allowed them to really see the connections among these challenges. And it also sparked conversations of other resources that they might need. So they wanted, for example, another map, which is this map that you see that shows all the community, the aqueduct. It has different things like where the church, like their places of gathering, where are points where they can go after an emergency, where are the points where EPA and the Department of Health can go and sample their water, right? So this was a map that wasn't part of the project, but it came throughout those conversations with the leaders. And as part of the conversations, we also learned, that different hazards were like hurricanes versus landslides versus earthquakes were not really impacting their opportunity to connect, but COVID did, because they're, again, a predominantly elderly community and they were, worried about social distancing and all this stuff. So their community cohesion was kind of eroding. And because of the broader structural challenges in Puerto Rico with migration, lack of economic opportunities and so forth, they're really concerned about this intergenerational knowledge transfer. So how are we training our youth to manage the aqueduct? How are we, working with different parts of the community to be able to respond to future events, because we are all now in our 60s and 70s. And so with that, we were able to get a second award following those results to really build in this idea of co-creating a community-centered assessment to understand now more in depth how individual households are experiencing these insecurities. And for that, the idea came from the first workshop, because we wanted, when we develop academically surveys, they tend to be for like regression analysis and big descriptive statistics and all these things, right? And so working with leaders that don't necessarily have higher education or technology access to be doing these types of analysis, we wanted to co-create a survey that they could easily implement on the ground, get data, and when FEMA or any other nonprofit organization would come to the community, or they would go to the local municipality or nonprofit organizations to get funds to address challenges, they had data to support those efforts. And so in this figure, you will see kind of like our process. We started with the community workshops. Then we went into the literature to inform around food, water, energy, and health. We did expert consultations. So we had academics that were expert across food, water, energy, and health, but we also had community leaders as experts from the community, right? And we did a small pilot survey to kind of test language reliability. And then we reconstructed it and created the survey. And I guess amongst the results, you know, in terms of like the value of this tool to do early identification of at-risk populations and monitoring health outcomes across context of time, I think one of the key takeaways from this exercise was seeing really how academics were perceiving that the key questions were in the for this toolkit versus what leaders perceive to be the key questions. So very quickly, I would say like the practicality, right? There's questions about income. There's questions about dimensions of food security that leaders don't necessarily are interested because they're within the community, right? So they really wanted to have questions that they could go and be like, you know, let's read, you know, this is the house that needs Pampers, or this is the house that is bedridden and they need assistance from a nurse in the wake of an event, right? Like they were really on the more practical side of things. So it really was an interesting exercise because the toolkit, even though it's mostly descriptive statistics, are extremely valuable for them to be able to go again and get more funding and bring in more resources in the community. So that exercise was really interesting. And so with that, and after conversations with the leaders, you know, one of their key concerns was like, we still feel that we're being studied and we kind of want to have things that can support our social cohesion and like our ability to address like key issues in the community. And that requires money. And I think that's like an underlying challenge that we have when we do this type of community engaged social science work, is that we're really good at documented, but we don't have necessarily the funds to just bring in money and just, you know, support local change. And so thankfully, the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado in Boulder opened a last call for more applied products. And we proposed to them to do a participatory budgeting. And if you're not familiar with it, participatory budgeting is a democratic process that allows community members to have direct role in deciding on a public budget. And so we were able to get $10,000 from the Natural Hazard Center, which is not a lot, but we were able to do a lot with it. And it's a way to start sparking conversations on how can we bridge funding from different agencies to really be able to, you know, deploy solutions that are community-led and residents-led primarily. So for that process, just give you a general sense, the value of participatory budgeting lies in three key areas. Empowerment, because it would encourage residents directly to be participating in governance aspects. This is the first participatory budgeting, to our knowledge, that is fully community-led. Usually participatory budgeting is coming from a public spending or from a nonprofit organization. The second aspect is transparency and accountability. So we were, you know, we have these $10,000, we announced it in the community, and now we need to spend it. So all eyes are on the money. And lastly, most importantly, to improve public services. And so in our particular case, what we did, and again, this is also important, right? Why we did this, right? For four key reasons. One, because we wanted to continue to support the self-management efforts and the leadership in the community in the wake of state neglect. Second, because we wanted to address this. We don't only want to be studied in the community. Third, highly connected, we wanted to contribute to the social cohesion and social capital. And again, an avenue to bring physical and social resources, which we have talked about from the beginning back in 2022, to address resource insecurities in public health. And so an overview, I guess from a research standpoint, we were really explicit that this was not going to be a research project. obviously as an academic, I was like, I need to collect some data because my job depends on this, but we're going to prioritize the budgeting exercise. And then later we'll do some focus groups and interviews to contextualize your experience, and that would be sufficient. And so we started in November of 2023. We created a steering committee. I'll detail more on this in the next slides. We did a request for proposals. We have 46 proposals. We condensed them into 9 proposals. We had our panel reviewed it, which are residents. One of the things that we did here is that we purposely chose people in the community that did not have leadership roles because we wanted to increase the diversity of the actors in the community and also support new leadership to be built from the community. There was a voting exercise. Roughly 22% of the community voted, which is pretty high for this type of exercises. And we're in the process of implementing the projects. And back in August, we did a community event to just do a general progress report and a presentation of this, project broadly throughout the last 3 years. Our core team is both of academics, but also we had a project coordinator on the ground, Javier, that without him, part of this project would not, run because we're all in different parts of the United States continental. We had 3 leaders that were also co-PIs of the project. We made a steering committee, and then we had members from the Corcovado community inform our processes. These are just some images of some of the materials that we shared in the community. We had a WhatsApp group. We did regular Zoom meetings. We shared this in the church and the bakery, right? Some people thought that we were from the government. It happened during elections, right? So there was a lot of confusion of people that had never seen this type of exercise being done in the community. Like I mentioned before, we received 46 proposals. 17 were outside of the criteria. The criteria was that it had to be a project around food, water, energy, and that the project cannot pass of more than $8,000. Because even though the award was $10,000, we needed $2,000 to pay our project manager. And so 9 proposals were voted, and we did a hybrid contextualizing the geography of the community. We did an in-person event, we did a virtual event, and then also opportunities. We gave like 2 weeks for people to vote. So it wasn't just a one-day thing. And then the results, the winning proposals, we had 3. One is solar power security cameras. The community has different assets like solar panels for the community aqueduct, and they were concerned about robbery and things like that. So that's being installed in different parts of the community. We did solar street lights. There's a part of the community is very dark. And also we put it in different parts of the community, like the community centers and areas where if events happen, they can easily come, and those are the locations where resources are distributed throughout the community. And then a series of educational workshops. And these are around food, water, energy, public health, and emergency management and response. And an opportunity for more social capital, cohesion, and connection within residents. Right now, we're in the process of the implementation. We have implemented the street lights and the cameras, but we're in the process of doing the last set of workshops, and then they will end in May of 2025. And I guess the overarching, key takeaways from this project so far, and to this question of this panel about, what kinds of questions should we ask in our research, and thinking about products and the way that we divide ourselves between being academics, but also being allies in the communities that we work with, is this part of creating new leadership in the community, right? Like an opportunity to have transparency in decision making. One of the key ones that we took away, at least from the academic side, was we had questions about why are we letting cameras to be part of these things that we vote when we have such a strong literature against policing and all these efforts, right? But the way the community framed it was more around like mental health and thinking about events that had happened, right? So there was a lot of conversations about what we thought would be the best solutions for the participatory budgeting versus what residents decided that was the best approach. And I think that's very, in many ways, beautiful because it's a lot of conversations to really understand what are the needs and what's guiding those needs, right? And so as a project that is informed by the community, that is led by the community, right? Like our role is to ask questions to, make them think through, is this the right approach or not? But then also allow that if that's the direction that the community wants to go, that we can be supportive of that. And so overall, right, this idea of what is the right question and how to determine that. I think for me personally, a lot of the questions that I asked or I used to when I started my career, there were really in things that were really interested to me. And so the more that I get to be in community in conversations with like leaders, for example, it allows me sometimes to even create like two parallel research agendas. Sometimes I find that some of the questions that leaders ask, they might already have been addressed, but they have not necessarily been addressed in the context of their community. So being mindful of, okay, let's then develop a project where these key questions that you're interested can be answered, and then can we also ask these questions? And sometimes they are the same, sometimes they're different, right? So it's dependent on the opportunity for conversation and transparency. And so I guess my closing remark on this project is that over the last 4 years, we've just seen, it started more in my own interest and what I see my career being driven by, but then it really quickly turned into something that they felt also it's part of their own interest. And now they have a full say and engage deeply in it and continue to advance it. Like my WhatsApp is like popping with like messages for the different activities and events, right? So they are excited and hopeful to continue to do this type of work, and their relationship with academia in many ways have shifted because traditionally they have been a community that just people go in, do interviews or collect samples, and then they leave, right? So they were really hesitant about doing this type of work. So it's taken 4 years and no publications yet from this project, right? So there as an early career person, right, there's also that thin line that one has to navigate between the requirements for our tenure and promotion and also our values and commitments with the people that we work with. So with that, I will end, and thank you so much for the opportunity.
All right. Well, first off, thank you to all of our panelists for these amazing presentations and for generating a lot of questions. To the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And Wen-Ning and I, who are co-chairing this panel, will direct those to the panelists. And to the panelists, we'll start out with a couple questions, but also want to open up the floor to you to ask each other questions and anything that has been brought up by these presentations. And I had some questions planned out, but I actually wanted to start with something that was generated by listening to these talks and something that I think Anais and Hannah both brought up, which is the tension between working in an academic sphere and trying to do community engaged research. And so just hearing you talk a little bit more about and to Jennifer as well, what is the relationship between doing academic research and doing community engaged research, and how do you balance these tensions between the necessities of your disciplines and academic careers and your desire to be responsible to the communities that you're working with?
I can go. I think, it's I don't think I would be in academia if I wouldn't be doing this work. If that gets me tenure or not, that's a different question. But I think that in terms of balancing, it's a lot of conversations that I have with my local partners, and I'm real about them, right? In terms of like, this, like what I mentioned about the participatory budgeting, right? Like I want to do this. I want us to do this because it's been years in this process, and we finally have funds to do something that is very applied and like on the ground. But can I later ask some questions about the experience and use that to frame it for my own like research agenda, right? And so they were okay with that. So they understand that this is also part of our jobs and our work, right? So it's I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of like conversations, being real and where our capacities lie, and also in this stage of our careers. When I was a PhD student and I wanted to do some of this work, like it was more challenging because I didn't have like, the flexibility or like the funding to do it, right? So I've been kind of like marinating those relationships. And now as an assistant professor, I can do this type of work. So I think there's also a lot of like mentorship and support and doing interdisciplinary collaborations. And so my colleagues and mentors have also been very supportive in thinking about, while you're working on this project, like what other things are you doing that is advancing your file? And so yeah, it's a lot of like strategizing, but I don't think I would have the energy to strategize if I wouldn't even have the opportunity to do this type of work in the first place. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question. It's one that I talk and think about a lot, including with Anais, through moral support dinners about how we can do this kind of work and still succeed on the tenure track. Uh, I have lots of thoughts. I think there's some, I both have quibbles with history continuing to rely on the single authored monograph method of communicating our findings, right? Like, there's still a lot of emphasis on the single authored book or the single authored research article. Um, and that is in many ways antithetical to doing and community engaged research, right? Particularly if you're working with um, any kind of methodologies that are thinking about equity in authorship or politics of citation, and like that my work and just the idea that my work occurs in a vacuum as if it is not the result of significant networks of community members, archivists, librarians, right? So I think that that's limiting in some ways, but at the same time, I am, the major tenure mile marker, right, is the book. Like I don't necessarily have to have a pretty consistent publication record. And so, at the end of your talk, Anais, you talked about like we've been doing this for 4 years, we still don't have publications. That's okay in history because a book takes a lot longer to write, right? I mean, I've been working on this since 2019. I mean, it's been many years that I've been working on this project. Um, so how do I navigate that? First is I have made it, one of the things that I'm really dedicated to with the book is that I want to publish it on a trade press list. I want it to be accessible to community members. Um, that does mean a different style of writing, I think. I don't think that means, sometimes we say that, oh, it needs a different style of writing. It's not like a dumbing down, right? It just needs to be accessible. It needs to not be jargon. Like I'm not overly concerned in this book with some larger history of tech stuff about like is an infrastructure an assemblage or what's happening here something called envirotech, which is these are really important theoretical conceptualizations for thinking about history of technology. But my book is really concerned with how these things impact everyday material conditions and how that happened historically and the connections between these infrastructures and systemic forms of racism, right? Infrastructure becomes the like physical manifestation of systemic forms of racism in many kinds of ways. And when we go to the archive, that's really clear, particularly in places like Mississippi. Like politicians were not real quiet in the tens and twenties about, who they thought should benefit from their infrastructure and who they thought should not benefit from their infrastructure. So that's, kind of both a thing that I have a quibble with and also something that maybe gives me a little more liberty in meeting these goals. Um, uh, but in general, I think that if institutions, places like Duke, which, when I was in the interview process of this job, placed a lot of emphasis on the climate commitment, on its sort of interdisciplinary work, on its engagement with communities. And the call for my job had the words environmental justice in it. And if you're going to hire people to do justice work, it's also incumbent on institutions and departments to make sure that their tenure standards are going to be applicable to that, right? So like that community work that I've done with Standing Rock or even a co-authored publication in a law review, those are not typically considered to be things that should count towards a tenure case in a history department. It's co-authored, it's not academic. It's not, a law review is peer reviewed, but not in the same way as a peer reviewed journal. So I also think that these, needs to be sort of conversations that we're having with our departments and with the institution. If they want to hire faculty, they need to support them to do this work. And then I think the last point is that point about time, right? This stuff takes a long time. And it's really hard to do a community engaged project either as a master's student or PhD student because you have a limited amount of time. And so trying to think about how to build up community engagement and trust over the long arc of a career once you are in an academic position, I think it feels a little less stressful. I felt like I wanted to do a lot with a dissertation that I didn't know if I was going to have the time to do. And now I'm trying to be very purposeful about utilizing the time and resources that I have at a really great job like this.
Um, can I add a little something, just a couple of points to make that I think sort of build off of what both Anais and Hannah were saying is, like this, it is really hard to go through that engagement and how to do, who gets credit and that kind of thing. Um, I'm fortunate because in environmental sciences, multi-authored publications are a lot more feasible and not looked at in any strange way. So we've actually been able to include community members on papers that we've published so far. And, they've been part of the authorship process, which has been great. Um, but I think one of the things that just I was thinking about when I was listening to Anaïs's and Hannah's talks also is that a lot of it is kind of fit for purpose. Like you listen to people and try as best as possible to meet those goals and ask the questions like, is what I'm presenting to you, is this helpful? Is there something that I haven't done? Is there something that I haven't measured? Um, how do you want us to be setting this up? And oftentimes, like in terms of some of the more technical things, how we do the air pollution measurements and that kind of thing, we've heard from community members like this is why we wanted you here in the first place. But I think there's also it's also worth saying like there've been other communities that we've spoken to that haven't wanted us in their community taking measurements. They want to do it themselves, and it's very community by community. And so I think the idea also of going in and providing the services that we can when they're wanted and stepping back and saying, okay, it's fine if you don't want us to have a role here. And we're here for you if you ever want anything. We're happy to help. We're happy to try to find resources. We're happy to show up at this meeting and just listen. Um, and trying to walk that line, I think, is also really important, even if it doesn't result in going after a grant or going after a paper or things like that, and just trying to be better listeners. And over time, I've just tried to work on that and just being a better listener to the people that we've met along the way. I think has also been helpful. And maybe that might also Elizabeth Brown had put a question in the chat about how we go about engaging community members, and I think that kind of speaks to that question as well as just trying to listen and be responsive and checking in and asking if what we're doing is satisfying what they want instead of it kind of turning into about what we as researchers need.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think we can go ahead and pivot to Elizabeth Brown's question, since we sort of started entering into this discussion. If Anais and Hannah want to comment on that as well.
Yeah, I can jump in on that question. And thank you so much for your thoughts as well, Jennifer. I would consider myself as occupying both an insider and an outsider position at each of my sites. And to explain that a little bit, so I grew up in Appalachia. I also grew up in a working, I'm a first generation PhD. I grew up in a working class community. I grew up in a community that's impacted by fossil fuel. It was built by the coal mining industry. Um, and within the broader regionality of the United States, I am an insider in the South. I mean, that's the South is quite different than the North. Going up to Cambridge is the first time I really felt like an outsider. So there is some like social capital, cultural capital that comes from being from the South, being from a working class background, being able to like speak the lingo in certain kinds of places, also recognizing that like You can't go into Appalachia and talk about the end of end of coal. You can't go into South Louisiana and talk about the end of petroleum. I mean, that's what built that's what sustains these communities. That's sort of a purposeful part of extraction capitalism, is that it, becomes the thing that these communities rely on. And so I'm not like coming in with an outside sort of perspective that I'm trying to impose on places. I also am an insider in Southeastern Native communities. I'm not doing research on ancestral Cherokee land, but I am working with other Southeastern Native people. We have shared cultural backgrounds. We have shared history and Mississippian mound builders that are really important to the landscape here. So that's like the insider perspective. And then, of course, I am obviously also an outsider. I'm not from Memphis. I'm not from the Mississippi Delta, which is its own pretty, unique cultural formation. I will say, I think it's very similar to Appalachia. There's a regional development commission in the Lower Mississippi Delta the same way there is in Appalachia. And so there's actually a lot of overlaps. I did have friends already existing in Memphis that helped me kind of network and connect with community members. Um, uh, I did a lot of the particularly Mississippi Delta is predominantly Black. I'm obviously a very white person. So, that's also an outsider perspective and trying to be attuned to the specific needs of African American communities, particularly, communities of the diaspora and communities that have suffered a lot from um, both out migration and also just significant under-resourcing. So how did I approach my communities? I just started showing up. I started showing up for community meetings. I started showing up for events. I started showing up in volunteer work. I think that one of the things that's really interesting about environmental justice is it cannot be disconnected from other movements for liberation. And, often in almost all instances, the community groups that I worked with, um, had to pivot to other disaster work, right? So both the pandemic, but also Hurricane Ida hit my Louisiana communities in the middle of my research. And so the folks I was working with immediately became hurricane disaster relief or pandemic disaster relief, or how can we get community members food when schools are shut down? Shelby County schools are shut down, right? How can we get hospital workers to hospitals in the middle of an ice storm in Memphis? We don't have infrastructure to deal with ice. And so it was a bunch of people with 4x4s who got together to drive people places. And so I think communities are more willing to trust you when they see you at other stuff, not just when it is beneficial to your research, right? That was part of why I really wanted to live in one of the communities that I was working within, is that you can show up in different kinds of ways there. You're not sort of parachuting in and out.
And I agree 1,000% with what Hannah mentioned. Showing up, being intentional. I think the other point is like being transparent of your intentions, right? Like, you have this idea, you like to, you identify the people that you might be able to show it to, hear their feedback, their perspective, their availability. Not always, and I like to say this concept, like, even when we're doing community engagement, it's not always that people are there like every single step of the day, right? Like people are doing other things in the community and in their life. Like they have jobs and other activities that they have to attend to, right? So it's this idea of being an asset or an added support rather than also being like a burden to their already day-to-day experiences. So being transparent of your intention of, what can they gain from this, what versus what you're gaining from it, and your values. I think people know. I feel like people can sense when it's a stereotypical extractive approach versus when you meaningfully want to learn and participate in their day-to-day and understand their experiences. So I think but again, it takes time. It takes months, it can take years, right? So your timelines in your projects and your ideas are also part of that conversation. And in my particular case, even though I am from Puerto Rico, I am not from this particular community. This community is like an hour away from where I live. So it's kind of like I have an insider because I'm from Puerto Rico, but this community is very different from where I grew up, right? So there's a lot of also learning that one has to do and unlearning in those processes as well. And being able to, I guess my overarching thing is like reflect and repair, right? Because sometimes we might like commit an error, ask the wrong question, or do something and then we disappear from the community. And so that it's better to just be open about these things when they come up and use this as an opportunity to then build up your relationship. So you have to just be be yourself, be good, be a and be a good citizen in that process.
I think that point about humility and listening and being very generous with yourself and making mistakes and with others with making mistakes is just like foundational to community work generally, right? Like you have to show up without ego. And that's a lot, academic ego is something that happens a lot, right? And so we also are like consistently positioned as experts. And I actually think you have to show up, as an expert of your field, but not an expert in this particular site or community. Um, and be willing to figure out how to make mistakes generatively, right? Like how to learn and adapt and communicate effectively. And to do so with, I love that you pointed out in your project, uh, Anais, that like the idea of cameras might like seem counterintuitive to folks who are sort of like steeped in and working in abolitionist literatures, but it was what the community needed. And you do like, and I also work a lot in, and I'm sure Jennifer, you've had similar experiences. Like South and rural Southern spaces are very conservative, and politically, that's quite different from my own politics. But you have to be able to sit down and have conversations with people and be able to recognize that coalitions are complicated and they're messy and they involve people with lots of different viewpoints.
I think that's an excellent point, and it's so true. I mean, there a lot of the people that I've worked with, you'll talk with them about the issues and everything makes perfect sense. And then, you show up at their door and there's a Trump sign there. I mean, not to make it political, but it probably is not a controversial thing in this circle to say that. Um, and you've got to just kind of look past that and talk to people on an individual level and hear what they need. And, we're ultimately there because they invited us in the case of the study that I'm doing, or because in the case of Anais' study that they thought it made sense to work with her and allowed her to come into the community. And when we go in with permission like that, it's important to not impose our views and just hear what it is that people are expressing what they need and help them to get that and be more of a documentarian than actually imposing what we think is right or wrong. And I think if we can do that effectively, then academics can be used as a tool for social good. And, the other stuff, I think over time, people, you know, will see what works and what doesn't work. And you know, if the politics that people are espousing doesn't work for them, they'll eventually come around to it. And that's not really our place. Our place is to help them with the thing that they brought us in to do.
So, there's no other question in the chat. I think we still have some time. So if anybody has questions, please feel free to put in the chat. In the meantime, I would love to ask a question. And I wanted to pick up on something that Hannah, you said in your presentation about how the research questions that you start with may not always be the research questions that you end with. And I think that somewhat of a theme in the various conversations that we've had and the presentations in terms of in Anais, your projects, the a lot of questions came up out of the first round and which shaped the second round of um, studies that you did. And so I was just wondering if the three of you could speak to this idea of your research question adapting over time, changing, and how that is seems to me part of the feature of community engaged work, which on one hand can be tough as a researcher if your questions are changing and evolving, but at the same time, I see that it could be also a strength, something that you can leverage to inform your work. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that process of the changing research question. Thank you.
I could speak to that quickly, which, there's tension that I've heard in a lot of meetings around this topic when you're talking about funding, like NIH funding, and going back a few months, um, so before the current dynamic, we, would have meetings in some of those funded centers among researchers, and there is truly tension between things like the funding cycle where you have, maybe 2 years, maybe three, maybe five to carry out a study with three distinct questions, distinct hypotheses, and communities don't work that way. And so a lot of researchers have showed up at these meetings and kind of implored NIH staff to try to help us rethink the model that we use for funding to accommodate community partnerships more. And I've seen more effort both from places like NIH or kind of other entities like the Health Effects Institute that have wanted now to see community generated questions that drive research. So there's a little bit more growing recognition. But I think one of the things that stands in tension to that is that even the funding timeline doesn't quite fit how these relationships work, where you need to just take your time. And I think Hannah had the the text that she had put up from Nixon, the slow violence concept, and to actually develop those relationships and conduct that study in an equitable manner in partnership. It's really difficult to do that when okay, I've got to satisfy this hypothesis. Um, when the questions just have to evolve and you have to be there sort of working in service. So I don't know that I have a great answer other than it's a line that I definitely feel needs to continue to be considered in this space so that we're making resources available in a way that meets the community where they are and not vice versa.
I'm happy to go second, if that's okay. I think that first of all, I love these interdisciplinary conversations because they really are just so fantastic for thinking about this. So once again, thank you to the organizers for setting up this conference. So historians are not as beholden to funding. That's another one of the kind of luxuries of being a historian. It just doesn't, frankly, particularly if you're doing work like I was, where I was living in the place that I was researching in, I was accessing local archives, I could hop in my car and drive there. Like, I am just not, like, it doesn't require quite as much funding to do. I did have to get some outside funding for my dissertation research. Um, I got two different fellowships with historical research centers. I did not get an NSF. I was rejected for that. So definitely not bitter at all about it. But there's just like acceptance within the disciplinary of history that your project proposal is a little bit of a work of divination, that like you really cannot predict what's going to be in an archive. You can go in with a finding aid, with some kind of idea, a container list about what's going to be in that archive, and you find something totally different or unexpected. And it is just really very broadly accepted that what you propose as a project or a book or an article really might not be what comes out on the other side. And so, thankfully, there's not like a ton of accountability of like to an original research design in the same kind of way that we're responsible for reporting our funding. I didn't really have to report anything back to either of my funding fellowships. One was with the Linda Hall Library in St. Louis, and one was with the Warren Center at Harvard. And just like eventually writing the dissertation was the thing that was, I did have to report back. So, and obviously like acknowledging where that funding came from within the finished work. Um, uh, but adaptability for me, each of my sites is an ongoing conflict. And so sometimes just what was happening in the present would shift the questions that were being asked. Also, just talking to community members and sussing out what history would actually be useful, right? Like, were they interested in looking at the, political way that this stuff was created, or looking at other ways that communities have dealt with it, or lots of these communities have a pretty decent, I mean, they have an understanding of their own history. And in some ways, some of what I was doing was just also extending that history back. So, there's definitely an understanding in each of these places about how Jim Crow and redlining impacts, spatial formations. But I'm really trying to take this back further, into the, early contact plantation formations that is just like a deeper history than what is sort of encountered in everyday environmental justice conversations about how, the levee that exists that continues to impact the Yazoo was originally built by planters. I mean, it was the way you defined private property in the plantation South was by building a levee, not by building a fence. And that's what really created instability along the river shoreline and then became what the Army Corps did, right? And so the Army Corps' construction now is inextricable from white supremacist sort of formations of enclosure from both Indigenous people and then also from African Americans. So and then also just like the stuff you find in an archive, which like sometimes goes in really incredible directions. So I went in with a question in my site in the Terrebonne about how infrastructure impacts Indigenous sovereignty, but I end up really getting into the weeds about the processes of peer review of the Army Corps, which are kind of fake. I don't know like a nicer way to say it. Every single peer review that's ever been done by the Army Corps has been done by one private company, private not-for-profit organization called Battelle Memorial, that has a bunch of former fossil fuel executives and people who were in the military-industrial complex that run it. So I think that really raises the question of what peer review, like what we mean by peer review when the Army Corps does it, right? And this kind of like the way that the Army Corps permits stuff in a way that really plays with our fundamental understandings in America of what private property is and the ability of the government to take your property, which Indigenous people know very well, and I think lots of particularly white landowners take for granted. But if the government wants your land for resource development, they're going to take it. That's just sort of ingrained in the way we have, constructed eminent domain law. The other one was I am a historian of science, but I didn't really expect to write about how science has been a handmaiden to environmental injustice over time. Science is really important for developing the fossil fuel industry. Mineral geologists are employed by fossil fuel companies uh, to go in and find this stuff. And we obviously like kind of construct science as this significant public good, but in lots of ways it has not been. And so that was something that it was these things that like that come up in these conversations that were unexpected that shifted the way I was approaching the research.
Anais, if you want to just close us out with just a couple of quick words, we should end in about a minute.
Perfect. I will just add to it that it's gonna depend on your research design and what you're seeing on the ground, right? And so from history to more environmental science, right? Like two different models. I sit right in the middle, and in some parts I'm able to modify my questions based on interactions with leaders, but in other ways I have to still stick to it because I want to advance a theoretical thinking on an approach, right? So it's gonna really depend on your local experience on the ground. And thanks again for the opportunity. This has been fun.